Okay, we're live. Good morning, everybody. Hope everyone's had a good holiday weekend, and it's good to have everyone back. It's a small free school today, but we have a massive topic for discussion. So yeah, we're going to talk about what we've been dealing with for many weeks, if not years, the question of the black worker in the history of capitalism and the future of democracy and humanity. And we're going to watch parts of an interview. But before that, Doc's going to say a bit.
Well, I have to tell you, I was just saying to Purba that a lot of what we're going to do today comes out of one of the questions, or the question she asked me at my house on Thanksgiving, which I couldn't answer. Uh, she said, and I don't want to imitate Bengali accent right now. She said, Doc, uh, what do you see in the coming year, something like that, for free school? And I said to her, I said, well, I don't have a plan for the next year because I'm confused about what's going to happen in the next week. The instability and crisis is so severe. And I didn't. And frankly, I have to say, Purv, I felt a bit unsatisfied that I couldn't give a more definitive answer because at that point I was very, very confused. But then after everybody left and after we cleaned up, thank you, Alice, and everything was back in order, I went upstairs and get ready to lay my burdens down and chill. So I had to think about what she asked me, because if we don't have a perspective or a way to think about a plan for 2026, I mean, what do we then do? What do we become a book club and just sit around and talk? Or do we have, or do we have a plan that is situated in a moral imperative, the things that we've been talking about for the last couple of years? And so, and Purba had mentioned, well, it's the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, which is also associated with the founding of the American state, not just the Declaration, although it had not yet been founded and a war of independence had to be fought. But so I was thinking about that, and I had listened a couple days earlier to this podcast of Sven Beckert. And by the way, I was impressed with it. I felt that what he was saying was not new. I mean, it was a very old thesis. But then it was Du Bois and Black Reconstruction that deepened it, and so on. But I felt that what they were doing was interesting. I'll talk about that later. And then I read an essay from the November 4th New York Times sent to me by Sambarto, which was a bit more confused. And I listened to a lecture that Sven Beckert, had given in Mumbai a couple years ago, which was not as coherent as this. And suddenly it became clear to me that what we must do in this coming year, we'll talk more about it, because there will be a great ideological struggle over the meaning of the American Revolution. Oh, by the way, and Alice and I were looking at this yesterday, the Atlantic has a whole issue. It came out in November. You almost have to be a subscriber to get it. And I want to become a short-term subscriber to get this on the American Revolution, entitled "The Unfinished Revolution." Sound familiar to all free school people? The Unfinished Revolution. So we'll have to go through those essays, but and then of course the Ken Burns series on the American Revolution, and I think Shantu has a subscription, so we have to come to your crib and just look at it in parts, I think. But anyway, then I thought the table has been set for us. Here it is. I mean, and the things that we have been talking about for these many years, and we've done it through Du Bois and Baldwin, the Black Struggle, King, the whole nine. And now, to me, the way I was feeling is now they have to come to us. Or in fact, they are coming to us, maybe by not even knowing it. But when I listen to Sven Beckert, and then I listened to an interview with the editor, Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic, and thinking about all of this, the unfinished American Revolution. Well, haven't we been saying that for I don't know how long now? And that the Black struggle has been the vanguard of attempting to finish the American Revolution. And our critique of Horn and other theories of settler colonialism, the 1619 Project, were all on target. So I suggested to Sambarto that we collectively listen to this podcast. It's about 30 minutes or 25 minutes, and it's worth listening to. Then I'll try to say a couple of things, and then we'll just open it up. And I hope that people will be able to hear it on the live stream.
People should let us know if they can't, but this has been tested.
Yeah,
Hope people
okay,
can hear us.
cool.
So I'm going to
Can I just say one other thing? I have to say this because I was just saying to Porter, because the whole thing of my birthday party, which I did not want. That's publicly known. I publicly stated it. Part of it is my own vanity. But part of it, but anyway, it was a beautiful thing, to tell you the truth. But it started with Porter and in Chicago, and which I think is her gift. Just like on Thanksgiving Day, she asked this question. I couldn't answer it. I had to think about it. We were in Chicago in, was it October, September, or something like
March.
that? No. Well,
April.
Well, we were in Chicago, and she asked me this question. Dark. She says, dark. Why haven't more people from your generation remained committed and active? And I had never thought about it. I really hadn't. And I said, Pope, I don't know. I mean, I can't. And then I had to start thinking, and out of that came my birthday party. But let me just tell them what I told you. I told her that she has a unique gift, an imagination that she doesn't recognize at all, where she can ask certain questions that are almost predictive of things to come. But what were you going to say now? Go ahead. I know you're going to deny it.
I mostly ask questions as a shortcut to get answers. I don't know if it.
And so, it's she who has force me to take on a Bengali English accent. Let me just a little gossip before we get. So Sambarto tells me that my Bengali accent, when I'm not using my North Philly accent, would shame many Bengalis. Now, that's the highest praise. But being around Bengalis, you can't help but start talking like a Bengali. But anyway, let me shut my mouth. We can get started.
Right. Yeah. Let's listen to some German accent for a change.
Okay, yeah.
As we listen to this interview.
When you listen to political conversations, you think we live in an age of great scarcity. We somehow, for some reason, we can't, provide everybody with housing. For some reason, we can't feed all of our children. For some reason, we can't provide everybody with high-quality healthcare. But especially in the United States, but also in much of the rest of the world, we actually can. But we somehow politically are not able to do so. And I think history is important in seeing that you see a lot of terrible things happening in the past, and of course how we got here was not always pretty, and we should remember that, and we should be aware of that. But we should also be aware of the possibilities of the world in which we live today. And yeah, I think we're pretty far away from that, though. My name is Sven Beckert. I'm a professor of American history at Harvard University, and I'm the director of a center on the study of global history and the co-director of a center on the study of the history of capitalism. I think first and foremost, markets have existed, and this is, maybe the first thing that you learn from the study of history. Markets have existed, as far as we know, they have existed throughout human history. So they're not something that's peculiar to the contemporary moment, or let's say to the history of the past 200 years in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. But economic life has changed drastically in the past, let's say, 500 years. And if we just focus on the study of markets as such, we miss, I think, the historical specificity of the kind of economic change that happened on planet Earth in the past 500 years. And I think this specificity of the change in economic life is best identified as the rise and spread of capitalism. And, there are many things that can be cited when you look at the history of capitalism that illustrate the specificity of capitalism as a form of the organization of economic life that is different from other forms of the organization of economic life. But, the one that, most of us know about the best is probably that there has been an acceleration of economic growth. Definitely, since about the year 1800, that is completely unprecedented in human life. And I think that kind of revolution in economic life generated this increase in human productivity and its humans' ability to produce things. And this is specific to the capitalist revolution. So, thinking about not just markets. I mean, markets are important to capitalism, clearly, but they're important to other forms of economic life as well. They change quite significantly over time and are also quite different at any given moment. But this would be insufficient, I think, to understand the dynamics of economic life in American society, but also more broadly globally in the past few hundred years. So Empire of Cotton is an effort to understand, it started out as an effort to understand what in the 19th century was clearly America's most important industry, both in agriculture as well as in manufacturing, namely the growing of cotton and the manufacturing of cotton textiles. I early on understood that this history cannot be understood purely in an American context. It's clearly a story that pushes beyond the boundaries of the United States, partly because the raw cotton produced in the United States was significant to the European Industrial Revolution. So it became clear to me that it wasn't just a history of cotton, but it was really through the lens of cotton. There was something we can understand about the history of capitalism in the United States, but also more broadly. And one of the things that there are many things we can see about that, but the most basic insight that we can take from the study of the history of cotton is that capitalism was a system of organizing economic activity that right from the beginning was very global. And its dynamic really was related not just to what happened in any one given place, but was related to how different places in the world related to one another, and places that were also fundamentally different from one another. So capitalism, in a way, did not emerge from and produce ever greater homogeneity, but it thrived on and produced ever greater difference. The big story from a world economic history perspective is that the world's cotton industry was the largest manufacturing industry that humans have engaged in during the past 1,000 years, approximately. So way before the Industrial Revolution. And the core of that industry up to the year 1800 or maybe even 1820 was clearly in South Asia, in India. This is where most cotton textiles consumed on planet Earth were produced. And in the wake of the Industrial Revolution of the 1770s, 1780s, and so on, that industry now moved from India to the European continent. And in a way, the book Empire of Cotton tries to explain of why this process happens and why it happens. And that then also brought in the history of the United States in two distinct ways. For one, the technology of cotton industrialization moved by the 1810s, 1820s, moved from the United Kingdom, moved to the United States, and there is significant industrialization in the United States, and it happens first and foremost in cotton textiles. But second, the United States by the early 19th century, so around the year 1800, already becomes the world's most important producer of raw cotton for export. It's really American cotton that feeds the Industrial Revolution, both domestically and in Europe as well. By 1850, 75% of all cotton consumed in European cotton mills comes from the United States. And of course, this cotton in the United States until 1861 is produced by enslaved workers. And so what we can see here is what I spoke to earlier, again, the kind of the differences in how production is organized or how labor is organized in various parts of the world produce the dynamic of capitalism itself. So it connects the enormously exploitative, enormously violent, but also enormously productive cotton plantations of the American South with the enormously productive cotton factories on the continent of Europe. And that, I think, this relationship, for complicated reasons, is really at the core of what this Industrial Revolution is about. And this Industrial Revolution is, I think, one of the most important, if not the most important event in all of human history. Capitalism is a co-production, first and foremost, of capital owners and of states. Capitalism is unimaginable without the state, conceptually unimaginable. Markets are conceptually unimaginable without the presence of the state. And you can, there's like almost an unending list of things you can cite for the importance of the state, from very basic, the regulation of markets, since, this is before the advent of capitalism even, since medieval times. It is the importance, many economists have emphasized the importance of institutions to the history of capitalism, which I completely agree with. But these institutions in the end are either created by or enforced by or backed by states. But you can also think of things such as colonialism, which is a state-run project, or you can think of the emergence of the welfare state, or the state, or the provision of money. This state is everywhere in the history of capitalism. You cannot think about capitalism, you cannot think about markets if you don't think at the same time about states as well. And it's also important for a question that, of course, many economic historians, economists, and others have spent a lot of energy thinking about, namely, why is it that capitalism emerged at a particular moment in time, and why is it that the kind of greatest dynamic in the development of capitalism emerged from a particular place on planet Earth, namely the continent of Europe? There have been rich people in the history of the world everywhere, from West Africa to China to India, the Aztec Empire, the city of Florence, in many, many different parts of the world. But it was really one part of the world in which there was a new kind of dynamic in economic development, and that was the continent of Europe. And here I would say the decisive difference between Europe and other parts of the world was that in Europe, exactly this coalition between capital owners and states emerged in a very particular way. And that propelled the European economy, that propelled European merchants into other regions of the world. And that was decisive in the European economic takeoff as it eventually happened. And to go back to the history of cotton, you can see that beautifully in that history, because without European presence and knowledge of India, let's say, the whole idea or the technology to produce the kinds of cotton textiles that became so important to global markets for European manufacturers would not have occurred in the first place, nor could they have secured the cotton that they needed for their factories, because cotton, by and large, did not grow on the European continent. So when this academic field of the study of the history of American capitalism emerged, one of the topics that it really zeroed on early was the question of how to think about slavery in the history of American capitalism. And the traditional opinion amongst most scholars was that these were two fundamentally different forms of organizing economic activities. They were, capitalism was about.
Just a quick thing for everybody listening. This is the crucial rupture in what he's doing and what his group is doing as compared to what is normally presented in American economic history, including Marxist economic history, that slave labor, not free labor, was not a working class in the tradition of free labor. This is a major rupture, but it's not, I don't think we will find it unusual, because this is what we've been saying for I don't know how long. And others have said, especially Du Bois. But I just want to draw everybody's attention. This is the cutoff point in his conceptualizing the history of capitalism, which will then put the African proletariat at the center of the trajectory, of the logic.
In the history of American capitalism. And the traditional opinion amongst most scholars was that these were two fundamentally different forms of organizing economic activities. They were, capitalism was about freedom and about free labor. And the Southern plantation economy was, of course, about slavery and coercion. And the story ran that, as the Industrial Revolution happened in the northern parts of the United States, it overpowered the institution of slavery and created the condition for its abolition. And this story is not completely wrong. But I think what recent scholarship on the history of American capitalism has shown is that American slavery has a very long history. It goes very deep into the human past. Wage labor has a very long history. It goes very deep into the human past. So neither wage labor nor slavery are invented by the institution of capitalism. But when we look at modern wage labor and modern slavery, I think both of them are deeply connected to the expansion of capitalism, and the American plantation economy from the onset, but especially after the turn-up from the 18th to the 19th century, becomes really deeply integrated and crucial to the global capitalist economy, as it is then still mostly focused on the continent of Europe. and you can see, let's say, the spatial expansion of American slavery into the more western parts of the South is directly related to the expansion of the European textile industry. It expands because it needs all of these the cotton supplies. The expansion of the American cotton industry is financed by credit from Europe, but also from the northern parts of the United States. Some of the industrial development of the northern parts of the United States, especially Rhode Island, are directly related to demand that comes out of the plantation economy. So I think we need to see that as part of one economy. For reasons that are probably now too complicated to explain, there was something particular about slavery that allowed the sudden, rapid expansion of commodity production that was not possible in other parts of the world dominated by peasant agriculture. So I think this was kind of the competitive advantage. This explains why slavery became so crucial to this particular moment in the history of capitalism. But of course, as we know, it was a moment in the history of capitalism. It came in the United States, it came to an end in 1865, it came to an end in Brazil in 1888, because at this point, the capitalist economy had become so powerful and the capacity of states in colonial territories had become so powerful that it now became possible to rearrange peasant agriculture in these parts of the world. And therefore, the dependence on slave-grown cotton diminished drastically. But for this historical moment, I think in the case of the United States, it's really from its founding to 1865. But if you think globally about the history of capitalism, it's really since the 16th century, the early 16th century, that the ability of Europeans to radically recast agriculture and the countryside in a significant part of the world, first in the Caribbean, then in Brazil, then in the northern parts of the Americas, this was crucial to the capitalist revolution. And here, slave labor was crucial to propelling this transformation of the global countryside. So as you can see, obviously the history of capitalism is much more than the history of cotton. And not everything about capitalism can be explained by just looking at the history of cotton. But we can already see one thing that is more broadly relevant to the history of capitalism, and this is its global nature. This industry already in 1820, so 200 years ago, it connected Asia because that was the source of most of the technology of modern cotton manufacturing. The continent of Europe, where much of the industrialization took place and where new machines were invented to make the spinning of cotton much more productive. And then the Americas, where much of the cotton was grown, and then Africa, where much of the labor came from that would, fuel cotton industrialization. So this is a strikingly modern kind of arrangement that probably many people would think, something that happened in the 1970s, maybe, or 1980s, but not in the 1820s. So here we have, I think, a very powerful example that capitalism is, as such, it's a global system. It cannot be understood by looking just at one particular part of the world. I mean, of course, we can see some things about capitalism by looking at one particular part of the world, but it is always global. And indeed, I just finished a book on the entire global history of capitalism, and the core argument of this book is that capitalism was born global from the very first moment of its emergence. It was global, and you can, I think, the world's first capitalists, to give like a banal example, the world's first capitalists were merchants, and what did they do? They traded across, the oceans, and this was way before the advent of the modern era, and much of the. So we talked about, the capitalist revolution to be a particularly dynamic form of organizing economic activity. And I think much of this dynamic comes exactly from its, unlike any other form of economic life that we've had on planet Earth, it comes from its global connections. It draws on, inputs, territories, raw materials, labor, markets in all corners of the world from the very beginning. And again, to amplify the point that I made earlier, often people think about capitalism as a form of the organization of economic life that makes everything ever more to be the same. And of course, some things do become the same. But I think the dynamic of capitalism comes exactly from its core ability to connect very different things to one another at the same moment. So this can be different systems of labor. We saw that when we talked about wage labor and slavery. It can be different forms of territorial organization, like, Singapore as a tiny city state and the United States as a very large territorial state, different forms of political rule, authoritarian regimes and liberal democratic regimes, all combined with one another. And I think that that helps explain the enormous dynamic that is embedded within the organization of economic life under capitalism, and that is fundamentally global. So I don't think you understand anything about capitalism by just looking at one part of the world. History does not allow you to predict the future. History does not repeat itself. History is not cyclical. But by studying history, you can see certain patterns that help you understand the past. And these patterns hopefully will also help you better make sense of the future. And so, learning from history suggests to me that, there will be tariff regimes, there will be, firmer borders, there will be a territorial reorganization of capitalism. But that as such is just going to reconfigure the global connectedness of capitalism as such, and not overcome it. Capitalism will remain to be global. We had another moment in world history, beginning really in the late 19th century, and then becoming particularly pronounced in around World War I, like in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, in which many of the things we're seeing happening now happened before. But even in those moments, capitalism remained in some sense global. There were very powerful colonial European states who, territorially controlled much of the world, and they intensified their trade with these parts of the world. So I would think that this is, it's not the end of capitalism, clearly not, and it's also not. It's also not that some of the capitalist economies will completely encase themselves within nation states. No, it's a reconfiguration of the territorial and global order of capitalism as such. That's the first thing. The second thing I would say is that we are today in a situation we never have been in human history. And this is, we have gained the ability to produce much of what people need on planet Earth to live pretty decent lives. The problem of much of economic history was the problem of production. There were limits to the human capacity to produce. Very serious limits. In some ways, and maybe we should pause and celebrate that, in some ways, we have gained an ability to produce so much with ever less human labor input that we can live pretty decent lives, and all of us. So the problem that we're facing today is not so much the problem of production, but it's the question of distribution. Who gets to have all these things that come out of our ever more productive economy? And I think there is a total disjunction between how we talk about economic life and what enormous possibilities we actually have in addressing many of the problems that humans have faced in the past. There is very little that, when you listen to political conversations, you think we live in an age of great scarcity. We somehow, for some reason, we can't provide everybody with housing. For some reason, we can't feed all of our children. For some reason, we can't provide everybody with high quality healthcare. But especially in the United States, but also in much of the rest of the world, we actually can. But we somehow politically are not able to do so. And I think history is important in seeing that you see a lot of terrible things happening in the past, and of course how we got here was not always pretty, and we should remember that, and we should be aware of that. But we should also be aware of the possibilities of the world in which we live today. And yeah, I think we're pretty far away from that, though. When you listen to
Yeah.
Okay. I think we're going to try to deconstruct it and subject it to a critique while admitting already that there's a certain complementarity between what they're doing, this research group, this high-powered academic research group, and what we've been doing for I don't know how long. I want to get back to that. His claim, and these are old claims, they're not new, that that capitalism arose as a global system, that the historians, such as one very famous British historian named Maurice Dobbs, who writes about the development of capitalism in England, they pretty much have argued that capitalism grew out of the transformation of European economic and social life from feudalism to the freeing up of the feudal peasantry to become the working class. That was standard. I think most, and Maurice Dobbs was a Marxist. I think most Marxists, including Marx himself, in some ways, and most liberal historians for a long time had said that capitalism arose in Europe as a result of social and economic processes unique and specific to Europe. Most African American historians, I mean, to a person, had pretty much argued against that. African American Caribbean scholars, such as Eric Williams, such as C.L.R. James, and certainly Du Bois, who makes the strongest case for the fact that capitalism arose out of global economic processes. And he is saying that. And that is a very strong and positive paradigm shift in American historiography. Now, we cannot minimize the fact that this comes out of Harvard University, the nation's most prestigious and wealthiest university. That these research groups on the history of capitalism were put together at Harvard, which means that the ruling elite feels a definite need for a new history of capitalism to answer the crisis of this stage of capitalism. Okay? So there is an ideological and political purpose to it, and we must not be unmindful of that, while acknowledging the paradigm shift in history writing of American history, the history of American capitalism, and tangentially, although he cannot fully do it, the history of Afro-America. For us, it is not a narrow economic question. It is more interdisciplinary in our way of doing interdisciplinary studies as opposed to the way Harvard professors would do it. For them, it is professors from already existing disciplines. Clearly, he is He talks about geography and the spaces, the geographies where capitalism took root in certain forms and so on. But as a German who I am presuming got his education and a good part of his higher education in Germany, where he was obviously schooled in classical Marxist theory. But at this point, he is obviously a social democrat. And I think we should come back to that. Well, maybe we won't, let's say it now. Just like here with the Mamdamis of the world, with the AOCs, with the Bernie Sanders of the world, there is an assumption at the very core of contemporary social democracy that capitalism is the end state of human economic organization. That, like Beckert argues in an essay in November in the New York Times, which Sambarto sent to me, is worth reading also, that this system, which has, and this is the Marxist concept, unleashed such powerful productive forces, meaning technology, that this system has produced more wealth, more income, and has resolved age-old problems of humanity, that this system, though it goes through crises, is the best and only game in town. So the question is not an alternative to capitalism, but how to reorganize capitalism, right? And this is a narrative for this time, for this crisis of global capitalism. Just a couple of things quickly. Besides reading Marx, and he knows Marx, you know, he's not sloganizing about it, but when you know what he's doing, you know that he knows Marx. He's talking about capital, he's talking about technology, and he's talking about labor. Three essential categories in Marxist political economy. But then he makes a leap to Du Boisian historiography and sociology when he acknowledges, and as I was just listening to, it didn't come across as strongly just now as it did the first time I listened to it, the centrality of the African proletariat. There was only a weak and small working class in Europe and the north of the United States. The working class that produces the wealth that would then produce more wealth and further produce wealth exponentially going forward was the African proletariat. He doesn't put it like we do. Well, first of all, the category of the African proletariat. We talk about this all of the time, you know, almost until we've been blue in the face, and it seems that nobody is listening. Well, maybe this guy has been listening, you know, or maybe he's read Du Bois where others have only talked about Du Bois. But this category, and we've said it in all these things, one of the great scientific discoveries by Du Bois is the discovery of the Black proletariat. We say it over and over again, which has necessitated a rethinking of logic, of all kinds of logic, logics of investigation, logics of history, logics of social structures, that the Hegelian dialectic, which is the best historical logic that we've had up to that point, explained a lot, but not enough. And that therefore we had to go to a more complex logic to understand more complex processes, and we called it trialectics. I think we are correct on that. And I know that just that Alice and Michelle and myself, we're kind of an informal group studying logics. And, but that will, when we talk about different kinds of interdisciplinarity, we'll talk about the free schools approach as opposed to the academic approach. But the central thing in his thesis is that without the African proletariat, even with all of the other global things, processes going on, the English capitalists, the English merchants, the northern state capitalists, the technology coming from India, and so on, without millions of African workers, capitalism could never have taken off and could not have ever made what we call a great leap forward. He does not say it the way we say it, because the consequences of saying it the way we are saying it means so much for the future, and is, how should I put it, our futuristic look, because of the weight and consequence that we put on the African proletariat, is vastly different than his. Okay? Where he would see ultimately a change of policy. Look, he would say capitalism has unleashed all of these productive forces. Never before in history has it been done. And he says that the Industrial Revolution is the greatest event in human history. And the reason he says that it is a Marxist calculation, that it unleashed productive forces that would produce wealth and income generation after generation after generation, till now we're at the point minimum amount of labor can produce enough goods and services that everybody can eat well, everybody can get health care, everybody can be housed. That is true. But when he says the question of production is no longer the problem, it is distribution. But he does not connect distribution firmly enough to who controls the state and the question of, as we say, a new democracy. You know, that is a decision of how the wealth produced will be distributed. That is a political decision. He has it absolutely right.
He has it what?
Oh, say it again.
He has it right.
He has it absolutely what?
The question is a question of distribution, and the question of distribution is a political question, which then I interpret through our lens is a question of who controls state power. There he will not go, for obvious reasons. He wouldn't be writing in the New York Times, I don't think, and maybe not have a job at Harvard. He might have to flee back to Germany. But anyway, he says enough to make clear that, yes, Marx, but Marx without Du Bois is like a person walking with one leg. To balance it out, to balance the human factor out, and to understand human history, you need Du Bois. And I would just mention two works, off the top, although it's all over Du Bois. Black Reconstruction in America. Everybody is now acknowledging it. Even Beckert, in his New York Times article, mentions the general strike in Black Reconstruction. I'm saying, God damn. You know what I'm saying? And this is very important because it is a recognition that, and he puts it this way, not like we would like to hear it, but that it was the general strike that decided the Civil War. I would say that plus the consciousness and agency of the African proletariat. You know. Of course, Black Reconstruction and the world in Africa. The world in Africa. And although we've talked a great deal about Black Reconstruction, we have not always talked a lot about, I know Sambarto has, however, about the world in Africa and the first chapter, The Collapse of Europe, which may have been the collapse of Europe, may have been predictive of the moment that we're now in. I want to underline, he doesn't say it, but it is a Marxist proposition, that historically, the historic significance of the rise of capitalism, as Beckert calls it, a new form of the organization of economic life, is that it freed up new productive forces. Now, most people, when they talk about productive forces, they're talking about hard technology, the cotton gin, the discovery of coal to power machinery and all this, like the first industrial revolution. But most times, and this is not Marx, by the way, most times they leave out as a central productive force labor. You know, it is not just technology. What runs technology is labor. And what was the labor force that ran the existing technology that produced this enormous wealth, which then produced more wealth? You know, it's this exponential process. You know, it's n to the infinite. You know, does that make sense? And that's, by the way, that's the way Beckert sees it. He sees it as that kind of algebraic, algebraic equation, n to the x, and an unending process of wealth creation. And his argument, I'll put it again, I think this is very important, that that capitalism is the most revolutionary system to ever be brought into human history, and it is such because it is constantly renewing itself through new productive forces. Now, that is a very difficult position to argue against if you're looking at productive forces without looking at labor. You know, the price, the cost to humanity becomes, not like he is saying, less onerous, it becomes more so. And we see this in the United States. We'll come back to this. What he does not say, but we can presume that he's thinking this way, the African proletariat is historically constituted. In other words, there was no African proletariat until the transatlantic slave trade, as brutal, terroristic, and vicious and genocidal as that was. It was one of the most consequential gifts of Africa to modernity. To understand the African gift to modernity, you must understand the African proletariat, which in its transformations becomes the Black proletariat, which is no longer African. You know, and that kind of a historical a historical explanation like this makes all of the cultural nationalist claims kind of very hollow, because this special group who survived through the transatlantic slave trade and plantation slavery produces modernity in a way that nobody else could. And thus, in the throes of this great historic struggle, was constituted and reconstituted itself. It was not static and without agency. That is why we study the history of consciousness of the African American people. He makes it clear cotton was the central commodity in the production of wealth. Again, I want to use the concept of a takeoff point, this is economic history term, or a great leap into the future, which, you know, so many people who are Eurocentric or white supremacists want to claim that all of this was the result of European genius. Well, I think he is saying something other than that. That there were historic processes which brought technology from India, ways of organizing trade and markets in Europe already existing, but the central productive force was the African proletariat, producing conditions for a great leap forward and for what we often call modernity. A new system whose antecedents for Beckert go back 500 years. 500 years. Well, the beginning of the African slave trade, but also the Protestant Reformation, which was the ideological conditions for this new system. There's an important book written by the German sociologist of the 19th century, Max Weber, called Capitalism and the Protestant Ethic. I think that's the right title. But what he says is people had to have new values, at least the ruling class, in order to function in this new system. That having been said, it would have led to nothing if there were not the African proletariat. Let me put it another way. The whole system rested upon the labor of Africans. I think Du Bois is absolutely right to call it a proletariat. Whether the proletariat would evolve into different forms in different parts of the world, for instance, the manufacturing proletariat. But the manufacturing proletariat only came into existence after the African proletariat, which produced the wealth that led to the formation or possibility of a manufacturing proletariat in London, in the northern states of the United States, and then other places. You know, one of Beckert's influences is a French historian named Braudel, who is associated with this school of thought in France called Durée, the long historical moment, as it were. And he would start 500 years ago. Of course, for us, we kind of go back to the Renaissance, and that as a key foundation of the civilization and ideological conditions for this new system to arise. Now, of course, in most economic histories, this other side, the civilization, the human, art, imagination and other things are not a part of it. It was not for nothing that, for instance, Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo painted human beings as human, and as human because they were human and not because God made them human. Let me see. I just want to say one more time, historically constituted. In other words, the formation of the African proletariat was not mainly or solely the work of the imagination or intentionalities of several people. You can take a settler colonialist view, 1619 Project view of evil intended people who were racist going back to the Renaissance and maybe to Greek and Roman civilization. And what they did in enslaving Black people, they could do nothing else. This is a subjectivist view of history. Of course, all history is made up of human beings, but human beings operate through history, through various logics of history. And so when we talk about a proletariat, a new class being formed, we are talking about a historically constituted in the throes of a historical process where multiple things are going on at the same time. And I'm not going to go into all of that. But Beckert does not, and in listening to lectures that he's given, I think we've been listening to some of them, he cannot quite imagine how a new class, he can talk about a new economic organization, but a new class, how was this class formed? There is no history of it. Even the most radical Marxists, he can tell you about the British factory system. But how was the African proletariat, who are responsible for this great leap forward into this new modern social organization we call capitalism? No one, it's like a mystery. How did this happen? And that is what we're trying to explain or to understand. Really, it is, I'm going to go a little quicker. Now, part of what we have been doing is saying, see, when he gets to his New York Times article, he talks about capitalism always going through crises. We're in a crisis now, but it is for him a crisis of transition to a new organization of capitalism and to new policies, not for a change from, but a change within capitalism. And he will talk about most of the periods since the defeat of slavery and the overturning of Reconstruction. But he does not identify this historical origin of the current set of crises. He will talk about the crisis of the 1920s, talks a lot about that, the free market policies of capitalism in the 1920s, and then the collapse leading to the Great Depression and the New Deal and Keynesian, Keynesian economics, and then the 1970s, and he gets that all wrong where he's at. And so now the breakdown of the neoliberal system and a turn towards sovereigntist, nationalist, protectionist economics. He's talking about Western capitalist regimes, of course. As a historian, he is blind to the defeat, first of all, the overturning of slavery, and then the defeat of Reconstruction. What Du Bois shows in Black Reconstruction is that Reconstruction could have unleashed even new, more productive forces which would only come to the South after the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. Capital and technology left the South after the defeat of Reconstruction. Du Bois imagined the possibility with the dictatorship of the Black proletariat. These are not throwaway terms in Du Bois's oeuvre. They are critical and strategic. With that dictatorship in full form, like in South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana, maybe in a compromised form in places like North Carolina, Florida, maybe, where there were equal numbers of blacks and white, poor whites, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But nonetheless, some form of a new democracy, of a dictatorship of the Black proletariat would unleash productive forces, including the Black proletariat as a productive force. And that is why Du Bois is always talking in novels and in sociological work, in Dark Water, different things we've read, in The Souls of Black Folk, the enormous capacity of Black people. The only one really writing like that at that time. And no one has, I don't think, risen to that level of explaining this capacity of a class that he defines in Black Reconstruction as a proletariat. And of course, when we talk, I feel a little shy about this sometimes. The Black proletariat is the proletariat itself. I say the Black proletariat is the proletariat in its becoming. I should have said the Black proletariat is the proletariat as it must become. In other words, and so it overlaps with Baldwin, The Last White Nation, that the problem that white people face is not Negroes, but themselves and their white identities. Whiteness is the problem of white people. And until they figure that out as a class and as a productive force, they will be limited. Relative to Black people, I don't think there's any two ways about that these days. I mean, you look at the two and you see the great potential, the great future, the great possibility on one side, and you see a dead end on the other side. Maybe I'm unfair in this regard, but white people like Tucker Carlson, I guess, and Nick Fuentes and the rest of the MAGA, they want a white answer to a deep societal crisis. When will you understand? There is no white answer. Part of the problem is whiteness. The crisis, the civilization, the social, the economic crisis, in a lot of ways, is a result of this system, this identity, and all of this complexity associated with whiteness. Baldwin is right. Baldwin is right. He's right. Well, you don't want to read Baldwin because he's Black, and you want to read the quote founding fathers. Well, stay in the 18th century because the world ain't waiting for you to come out of that bullshit. But anyway, you get my point. I don't want to talk too much. But Beckert does not understand that the basic transformation was the defeat of Reconstruction. Because the possibilities inherent in Reconstruction were then cut off. The greatest force for the accumulation of wealth and for the coming into existence of capitalism, the black proletariat, were marginalized. But they never were defeated. And I always say this, black people never accepted the defeat of Reconstruction. They never accepted that they were inferior and second-class citizens. They always fought, which is, you could see it in the larger historic sense. First of all, they were already a historically constituted class. But then they were a historically constituted class with a very high level of consciousness. That consciousness never left, even up to this day. And that's, of course, what we're studying, the industrialization, black gods, and all of that. But Beckert doesn't understand the defeat of Reconstruction. And although he will, in his essay in New York Times, draw attention to the general strike, which I think that's the first time I heard a mainstream historian even mention that. I'm just saying, I'm holding my breath. In the next article, you mentioned the dictatorship of the black proletariat. Now, if you go there, you might lose your job, homeboy. I hate to tell you this. You may have gone too far for the ruling class to stomach. Of course, I'm joking about this. I have to, Sarika, you might not know how I make jokes of things. But it is that. The trajectory of crises after crises after crises in the American system, I think, can be traceable to the defeat of Reconstruction, an attempt to organize an economic and social system based upon whiteness, what we call, and I think this is an explanatory framework, a white supremacist social system, within which a capitalist economy operates. And for me, it's like, voila, it's all clear now. For Beckert, he gets more confused, more obscurantist. For example, and then I think I'm going to, he gets, because he sees the black proletariat up to the end of slavery. His assumption is that as a class and as a revolutionary force in history, the black proletariat has been exhausted. And that is an assumption of white historiography, white sociology, not just white and black.
Yeah.
You know, the idea that the black proletariat is exhausted as a class and as a force for revolutionary change. Beckert makes that argument. So when he gets to the period of the civil rights movement, what we call the Third American Revolution, okay? He gets it all wrong. He doesn't even understand what he's looking at. But how could he? He's from Europe. You know, he can see binaries, but he cannot see a trilectic. A class among two other dominant social classes. Does that, you know, that's that trilectic. The trilectic that we're talking about is an attempt to understand social class and human agency. Because, you know, history is not made because you have a brilliant individual. History is made because social forces contending on many issues, one side becomes dominant. And this is, if one wishes to understand where black people have stood since the defeat of Reconstruction, it is in this contest, where their agency as a class has in many ways been opposed by a united front of white people, white workers and white capitalists uniting under the claim of whiteness. But then now, that unity is threatened, but the black proletariat remains pretty much as it has been since Reconstruction. And that's why, like we go to these churches, the Nation of Islam, all of that grew out of the first migration. Because we want to understand how that agency manifests itself. And I think we're close to it, by the way. I just went to two forms of interdisciplinarity. What they do at Harvard, the history of capitalism, this new economic thinking. And they have a website, and they really have good, I guess they have filmmakers and videographers that know how to do it well and to present these people. Because white people are very concerned with how things look. We must make it look a certain way in order for, but anyway, that's another question. Their interdisciplinary group consists of people from various disciplines: economics, history, geography, technology, and other things. So it is a coming together of people from already formed intellectual and academic fields. And so it is very limited. For example, they exist in fields that we've talked about. Well, we here at the Free School, we do interdisciplinary discourse. It's not like theirs, because one, we have more people who are scientists and trained in fields as information science, statistics, and other things, people who never thought about what they studied in undergraduate school once they graduated, because they thought it had no use. And then suddenly, I'm talking about Allison and Michelle. And I can understand that. It was really, you were educated to get a job and not to change the world. And suddenly it occurs that you have skills and knowledge that would help change the world. And logic is not an abstraction. That logic understood properly could help to understand social systems. And part of what we do is logic. Because what? We're not just trying to understand the economic system or an economic crisis. We're attempting to understand the social system as such. Okay? And even to understand what we mean by social system. And what does it mean if we say a white supremacist social system and Beckert and others say a capitalist economic system? Well, one, we're talking about a social system. He's talking about an economic system. His assumption is pretty much a European Marxist and other social democratic idea that the social system emerges from the economic system. Our claim, based upon the defeat of Reconstruction when the social system comes into being, that a social system is an initial condition for the economic system. And to me, the concept of an initial condition, I don't want to use Kant, a priori, and I don't want to, because it's not quite a priori, but it is an initial condition, which sees white supremacy is as a constituent, a constituting part of the overall social system, if not the basis of the social system. I mean, it is a difference of worldview. It's a difference of deployment of fields of knowledge. Okay, logic is one. Well, we do a lot with epistemology. You know, what are the assumptions here? I know Alice and I, we were talking about this yesterday, trying to understand the logic of investigation, let us say, of Gerald Horne, you know, which will take some doing, because sometimes academics are all over the place and it, you know, but trying to understand, and this is a question of inductive logic, I think, the logic of investigation, and how far can certain logics of investigation take us. And of course, this kind of investigation of logics and logics of investigation overlaps with what you all do, what you do in biology, biological research, and physics research. The other thing is our interdisciplinary approach is not only guided towards understanding the macro system, but understanding the human beings that make it up. In particular, we have made as an initial point of our investigation the Black proletariat. A lot of people say, oh, you guys are just out on a limb, that doesn't make sense, and yada, yada, yada. And they would say, look, Beckert and these people at Harvard, they're producing books. Yes, they are. And I'm not a big fan of books these days, to tell you the truth. I have to reference you again, Al. Al was, looking at my books, dark, this, that. I said, man, look, I done gave up on books in a lot of ways. If you can't put it in an essay, aren't you, man? Because a lot of these books are mainly vanity efforts or propaganda efforts. So I don't, but anyway, people say, well, look, Harvard, they're producing all these books. Yes. Look, they're getting articles in the New York Times. Yes, but who owns the New York Times, by the way? Or different questions like this. But you guys are, like black swans, unusual. You guys are far from the centers of dominant research and thinking. So and most people think this way, and this is part of capitalist logic, don't all things gravitate towards a point of equilibrium, towards a central point? Isn't that the optimum of knowledge? We're saying, well, not really, but we are, and this is what I think, and it's very important for us to see. There is movement among dominant figures, dominant institutions, towards an understanding that reflects outliers like ourselves. And it took, frankly, and this is part of the work I do in sociology, is sociology of knowledge. So often, the new in thinking has to break with dominant institutions in order to think anew. And so we had to do it this way. Now, and I always say this, and this is Purba's question about me. This could not be done without a global intercivilizational coming together like the preschool has done. And this is based on my experience. First of all, we can think better than the Harvard people because they're all white anyway. They might bring in a Chinese person or an Indian, you know, that is white as the driven snow in his soul. But a lot of these things I'm saying to make them laugh. These are little inside jokes. Kathy will explain this. Yes, you can see the way they laugh. But anyway, the white Asian, so to speak, the sociologically and civilizationally white Asian that serves the interests of white society and white civilization. That's what so they might bring that in. But organic to what the free school has become is the unity of civilizations. And it is a unity of civilizations. And it is a unity of civilizational ways of thinking, you know? And if you pay attention to what the free school does, you're in a constant learning process. I know I am. Because so often, the way people from other civilizations, first of all, that you speak other languages. This is hugely important, not just because of the linguistic capability, but because language is a way of transmitting meaning. So you all look at the world, or even read Du Bois, from the standpoint of the civilizations from which you come. So it is organic to us to be intercivilizational and to respect every civilization. Beckert talks about difference and homogeneity, that capitalism creates a homogeneous world of similarities, and it's true. I mean, the very fact that you all, let's say from China, can see us from Afro-America does represent a kind of homogenization of the world, you know, not fast enough. China needs to do more in this regard, but you go throughout Asia, there's a deep interest in Black culture, Black music, and Black people. Africa, the same thing. Latin America, too. But we see the world in this civilizational and organic way. The Harvard research group can only see the world through white assumptions. They can't do it any other way. And they're not set up to do it any other way, by the way. The initial conditions for what the Harvard group does and what the free school does are vastly and radically different. Okay. The initial condition. Just the last point. Is capitalism constantly revolutionizing itself? This is a huge question. It's been asserted almost since the time of Adam Smith that we've discovered a new form of economic organization which will constantly revolutionize itself. But are we at a crisis unlike the 1930s, unlike other periods, 1970s and so on, where capitalism, especially American capitalism, but capitalism, Euro-American capitalism, has reached what looks like an end state? The problems are huge, and we've identified them: deindustrialization. How does this country reindustrialize in the face of Asia and Africa, which are competitors in the industrialization process? The cost of empire. Beckert never talks about empire, doesn't use, he talks about the empire of cotton, but not actual empire, not the American empire, I don't think. The crisis of governance. Now, he partially addresses that, you know, that we can through wise planning or organization or thinking, we can overcome the crisis of governance and win the people back. Okay, maybe so. But then the crisis of civilization and finally the crisis of knowledge. Will capitalism be able to surmount these? Or will it take a revolution by which I think we're talking about the masses of people seizing the state in order to change the state and to change society? We're talking about a new democracy and a all humanity united front for peace and democracy. We look at it very differently from him. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I can say something.
Would you quote from UCLA too?
Oh, okay, okay, yeah. Well, I remember reading this article in New York Times on November 4th, what was the title?
The old order is, yeah,
The
I
old
shared it
order
in
is dead, do not resuscitate. And I remember finding it striking that he had Du Bois's general strike.
Yes.
But I feel like that essay, I didn't know what to do with it because it seems like he was identifying a moment of crisis for capitalism, but like he was identifying what the crisis was, but didn't have in that essay particularly, and maybe because it's an essay in the New York Times, it did not have an analysis of what gave rise to the crisis or what is the actual problem that American people are responding to, which has led to this crisis of the economic order and capitalism and so on. And actually, the interviews, I mean, I got this from Doc and maybe through your conversations with Raju also, the whatever, it wasn't an interview, the podcast that we listened to in the beginning. I actually found that and some other interviews that he has done a lot more clear in terms of what his position is, and actually not, I mean, pretty progressive in terms of coming closer to where we are also in understanding some of this. And I just wanted to draw out a few things that I feel like could be like, you know, expanded on a little more, where well, the first thing when he talks about the historical specificity of the transformation of economic life that that this new emerging capitalist order represented, and the idea of this historical specificity, it reminded me of two things. Well, the first thing, Doc, you already talked about, which is like the importance of slavery to forming that, you know, transformation of economic life, where I think Du Bois also talks about it, I forget where, maybe in Work and Wealth, or maybe just in Black Reconstruction, where slavery, it's not like the enslaved worker was primarily filling a need of a capitalistic or a theory of capitalism that had been fully worked out. But in fact, slavery created conditions for a certain kind of capitalism to develop, where I think it also was surprising to the people. I mean, to the, you know, to the slaveholders and so on and so forth, what would emerge from that. So this thing of slavery not fulfilling a need that was already identified, but in fact creating the need for a certain kind of, you know, economic order. And the other,
Could you say fulfilling and creating? Could you?
yeah,
What
like
do you mean by those two?
I feel like the productivity of the plantation economy was unprecedented. It couldn't have been predicted, and what was possible to be produced by the plantation economy gave a new vision for what an economic order based on it could even be. And I think Du Bois points this out, and if sort of rearranged, I feel like Sven Beckert's argument would also lead to that point, except he doesn't say it like Du Bois does. And the other thing it reminded me was this point that he also makes, which I've thought about a lot, is why did this emerge only in a small place in the world? Like, why did it have to be Europe? You know, like why was a whole economic order with slavery as its underlying foundation, why was it Europe that went there, and the whole world. And he makes this point a lot also, is that markets existed everywhere, rich people existed everywhere, but it was really European. It was a European idea of this world, a global capitalistic order. And it sort of draws attention to something that I think the free school pays a lot of attention to, which is the history of consciousness. Like a lot of this depending on certain ideas or philosophies or worldviews taking hold of people in a certain place, which then has the possibility of becoming a global way of thinking about what the economic order and so on. The other thing that I wanted to point out was this question that you were raising, Doc, towards the end. What Sven Beckert says is that even though you have to see capitalism as a global phenomenon, like you cannot just study American capitalism and then be like, oh, this tells us something, unless you study it in the networks, the global networks in which, both money, but then trade and, you know, the surplus of labor and whatever moves around. If you don't identify those networks, you don't understand what this order is about. But then I thought, and I don't fully understand it, so it would be good to talk about it, is he says that it did not lead to more homogenizing. It did not lead to everything all across the world under this sort of global order becoming more homogeneous. In fact, from the very beginning, capitalism thrived on and produced more difference. Yeah,
Does he make that point?
he does make that
I don't
point.
know if he said produce more difference.
He does.
Really?
Yeah.
I thought he said, if I might just ask,
Yeah.
and I thought he was saying it produces homogeneity and difference, but more homogeneity by uniting.
I think
But
I said that classically it is believed to be producing homogeneity.
okay.
But what actually happens is like differences are created and those differences are exploited to
Okay.
actually
See, I'm missing.
propagate
Yeah.
the system of capitalism.
No, I do think
Yes,
he's
yes,
trying to say that
yes.
something that connects the whole world, ironically, also exacerbates
Exactly.
differences.
Okay,
And I thought that was an interesting thing to point out, and I agree with it. I do think, because like listening to him in some other interviews, he's also saying that when capitalism in its very early stages emerges, when it's not even like taken seriously, even in Europe, and there's like a lot of religious backlash to it or whatever, but it primarily emerges through all of these people going out in the world for trade, like countries in Europe colliding with countries and civilizations in Asia and Africa on the basis of trade. And I thought that was interesting because in its genesis it seemed to have that sort of like vision of a whole world coming together. And Du Bois also talks about that modernity created conditions for human beings, irrespective of their nationality, irrespective of their civilizations, to actually come together in ways that were not possible anymore. But I think that makes this thing that the Western capitalistic mode of economic organizing actually exacerbates differences rather than having a homogeneous thing that can fit the realities of different civilizations, different peoples at different stages of historical development. I find that to be pretty interesting, although I don't feel like I got an answer from Sven Beckert about what that represents. I think Du Bois, in saying that the color line is the central contradiction of modernity, offers more of an answer to deal with that question of why like this led to more difference, even though it was the coming together of a world in some ways. And then the other thing that I found significant was what he says about the state, where he says that capitalism and even markets, for that matter, is unimaginable without the existence of the state. And then like what are the consequences of that
Yes.
for today? And this is also what we were saying is, and this is maybe the deficiency of that New York Times essay, is he doesn't have an answer for what the American state is today, how that relates to the crisis of capitalism, and then also what kind of transformation would be required for the American state to get out of this crisis. Is if that makes sense. That's sort of the deficiency I felt. And I think the last thing I wanted to say was all of this suggests to me, and this is not new, we have been talking about it for a long time, is that I think the oppressive structures of Western or white capitalism are something that people have been talking about for a long time, saying, "Oh, this has to be overturned." And of course, like there are strong points of agreement there. Like there are certain things that do need to be overturned. But all of this, and especially Du Bois's theorizing, leads you, or the next step towards Sven Beckert is what he's saying, should be that the transformation of capitalism is not a thing in itself, but happens as part of a broader transformation, which, when you see slavery as foundational to the establishment of this new economic order, sort of presents itself to you, you know. But what is that broader transformation? I feel like has been what the free school has been in the business of for a very long time. I'll stop there and say more later.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to just add to this conversation about how laissez-faire capitalism was sort of conceived, or it developed as something that would bring everybody uh, like to be the same. Like the homogeneity was supposed to come from the fact that, okay, if you have free trade, if you don't have people interfering in free trade, everybody, because of the amount of freedom that you are given, would eventually come to the same place. That is one of the, I wouldn't say an argument, but the hope of liberalism.
Yes,
But what
even
but
neoliberalism.
actually, yes, even neoliberalism. But then what happened, and what is reality, and what Sven Beckert sort of acknowledges but doesn't really go into, is what that capitalism as a system produces a lot of heterogeneity. It produces a lot of differences in how states operate. And now that concept of the state became very important to me. When he says that, capitalism is unimaginable without the presence of the state, it is unimaginable without the intentions of the state.
Absolutely.
And so, what I feel like is kind of missing in his analysis, but we've talked about it a lot, is that to understand how capitalism has affected people and why it has produced so many differences, why was the Cold War necessary, is because of these intentions of the state. And I wanted to, if possible, read out a small part from Du Bois's World in Africa. Um, this is my favorite work by Du Bois. In a way, it's very personal for me because it is the work that brought me into the free school. And this is from the last chapter of World in Africa, called Andromeda.
Yes.
And where Du Bois says, the sin of capitalism is secrecy, the deliberate concealing of the character, methods, and result of efforts to satisfy human wants. When men choose and understand their work and see its results, and can sell their toil in open market to those who want and use it, there is opportunity for ethical judgment, public justice, and commonweal. But when the nature of work, its methods and results are
Read
hidden,
that, the what? The neither.
When the
when the
nature
nature
of
of
Oh,
work,
nature.
its methods and results are hidden behind legal barriers, so that a man knows neither what he is doing, nor what the results of his toils will be, or who will enjoy it, or why, nor whence, nor how his income is made, nor at whose hurt or will, then the opportunity for human degradation is limited only by the evil possibilities of the lowest of men. Murder and theft may ensue with no chance to fix the guilt. Not mass production, but mass concealment is the sin of the capitalistic system. This is the meaning of African slavery, and this is the virus it poured into the veins of modern culture and fatally poisoned it. Once all the facts of industrial processes are known, Then if a man eats, he should work. Then if he does not work, he should not eat, unless the free intelligent judgment of his fellows declares that his existence at public expense is for the public weal. This and this alone is democracy.
But when was that written?
When?
Yeah.
35?
No,
Oh,
47.
no, no, he
47.
did it after like 40. Yeah,
Yeah,
48?
after World
No,
War II.
46, 47.
47.
Oh, yeah.
After World War
This is
II.
about Reconstruction.
And so, he makes a really, like everywhere, he makes a really powerful case for democracy. How the lives of your men are in the hands of other men. And he says that democracy is not a privilege, it is an opportunity. And with this, I remembered this as we were talking, because I think what Voice is really trying to drive home is that the intentions of fellow man, the intentions of the state in particular with respect to capitalism, does in the American case, it has sort of taken capitalism off a rail that it might have gone on. Like if Reconstruction had actually happened, if Reconstruction did not fail, I think capitalism would still exist. But how is the question? We would never know because
Yes. Can I make one point? I think this is a point here. You see, his argument is based upon capitalism is revolutionary because it constantly frees up and creates new productive forces of technology. What Du Bois sees and what Beckert does not see is that labor is a productive force and probably the decisive one. And for Du Bois in World in Africa, it is the African proletariat or the black proletariat and the colonized proletariat in Africa and Asia. And so to free them is to free the decisive productive forces. And that's what he means by democracy. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. No, I'm finished.
okay. So I think that um, when Sven says that, I really do agree with him, because I think this is a point that we've made, but I have not heard it in a lot of places, where he says that there is a deep uh, distinction between American capitalism, which is based on freedom and democracy, but ultimately based in slavery and coercion.
Yeah.
So these are two. This is a logic that cannot coexist. Like so. So I think that he has gotten to the point that Du Bois had gotten to a long time ago, which is that it is an illogical system which has produced something that you claim to be free and democratic. And I think I do agree that this with what Purva said, that slavery as a system caused capitalism to expand. And I think even Beckett kind of says this in a different way, is that when they found out how productive the southern U.S. Cotton Kingdom or labor was, the demand in Europe increased, and that European demand sort of made slavery expand into the western part of the South. But I think that when he points out that this slavery became essential to capitalism in this moment in time, he is going against the classical Marxist theorizing.
I think you're right about that.
Because Marx said that all of history is class struggle, and there's the thesis, antithesis, and all of that. But what Beckert says is that not all of the history of capitalism is, violent and exploitative, but this is a particularly violent and exploitative moment in history, and it is a singular point in human history that sort of produces the rest of it.
See, and I think just from a logical point of view, as even if we do inductive logic, logics of investigation, we have to say, and I don't think Marx makes it clear enough, what are the initial conditions for the factory system in England, which is what he studies in Das Kapital. What are initial conditions? And this is what Beckert is getting at. The initial condition is the slave trade and slavery. By the way, it was not just the plantation that produced wealth, it was the slave trade itself that produced wealth. And to see, and any diagnosis of what makes capitalism what it is must be a diagnosis of the slave trade and slavery. You can't, as an existing condition, but also as a constituting or structuring structure of capitalism. And I think Beckert makes the point that whatever capitalism became is anchored to the slave trade and slavery. Now, all the consequences of that leading up to today, I don't know that he pulls up. But go ahead, Al.
Oh no!
I'm sorry.
I'm
Forgive
sorry.
me, man.
Just my last point is that when he has another book, right, The Empire of Cotton. I was trying to look into that, and I chat GPT'd it, and what I got from it is it's basically like, this is my personal opinion, but I thought that it was a kind of incomplete world in Africa.
Or fake world.
Yeah, a poorly plagiarized world in Africa. Because I think he gets a lot from Du Bois, but he refuses to sort of get into that territory where white supremacy was a means to sustain economic exploitation. That was the central, for me, that was very central in Du Bois's thesis in World in Africa. And I think I haven't gone through all of it, but
as an initial condition for the system of exploitation, the form of exploitation of labor, period.
Yeah.
An initial condition was the exploitation of African labor. And I think he gets closer. I'm sorry to keep interrupting you, man.
No, I'm actually interested. I haven't read all of it, but I am interested to see if he actually acknowledges that the world wars were fought because of the colonies, because it was a fight against the control of colonies. What's up?
I just want to ask you.
Well, can I just ask you one quick question? Did you listen to the Bombay?
Yeah, the Bombay one.
Bombay, yes. What did you think of that?
I thought it was quite incomprehensible, really. I thought that he makes a lot of the same points that he makes in the book. This is my personal problem. I feel like the way that he talks, I can't follow very well. But I think that, like, he makes the argument, that slavery has existed for a long time. People's labor has been commodified and bought and sold, and that is distinctly different from, at least I am interpreting that he says that it's different from what happened in America during the time of slavery.
You said it was in Bombay or was it in Mumbai?
It's the same thing.
It's the same place.
Oh, sorry.
One is a British name and one is the,
Oh, I'm sorry. Forgive me.
But yeah, go on.
I think I think it's it. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, because this guy Beckert, I've never heard of him before. Thank you very much. Does he acknowledge Du Bois explicitly at any point?
Yes.
He does.
Yes. Oh, yes. Especially Black Reconstruction, and especially the chapter on the general strike, which made it shocking that, because, yeah. But the ghost of Du Bois is all over him. If you know Du Bois and you know Marx, you see both of them all in Beckert.
I was going to say this is really interesting in the context of the crisis and how the ruling elite essentially perceives the crisis. And because it seems like actually throughout the interview that we heard, I haven't read his other articles, is that it seems like a concession essentially of the ruling elite and a recognition of the multipolarity of the world. In the sense that it sees, I don't know if it sees that America can exist as the dominant force in the world as it once was. And so therefore in this interview, he's talking about difference. And I think it's pushing towards a narrative of America essentially is on its back foot rather than now being on its front, attacking other nations and how they organize economic activity. And so what this means essentially is you, I guess, kind of got to it, which is this element of democracy, where I think instead the interview itself didn't have as strong of like anti-communist sentiment, where it's like it was more of a defense of capitalism rather than a defense of democracy. Meaning, if it was framed in the lens of democracy, its assumption is that other economic systems are non-democratic and therefore immoral. But this one seemed more of a, like, it perceives the crisis of America and therefore it has to defend its system as being, productive, as being moral in spite of some of its objective as being moral, but in spite of the oppression that talks about with slavery. And so therefore his whole argument essentially is there's something good to capitalism. We need to fix it, reform it to its original ideals. But I think it's an oversimplification because I think even Du Bois says this too, which is that in even the white supremacist social system, or I don't know if Du Bois puts it exactly that way, but essentially even in the system of America, there's always also been socialistic components to it. It's not solely capitalist in the sense of economic formations, meaning like with the New Deal, you have Social Security, you have these different elements of socialism. And so is this way of analysis of the crisis of America as a crisis of capitalism solely enough, or a crisis of solely the economic order enough? And I think you've expounded on why it's limited, because it's not just a question of the economic mode, but it's also a question of the state, which he kind of gets at, where he says capitalism is contingent upon the state, and therefore the question of who is in control of the state. Is it the ruling elite? Is it a small portion of society, or is it actually something that's democratic of the people? And I guess I say that to say, like, I think the interview itself, I think it gets more of the element. I feel like, and I only got this because we had conversations yesterday about this, but it's like, I think there's definitely the ruling elite feels like it's on its back foot. It, rather than now proselytizing, it's now defending or trying to make sense of what is the crisis itself. And then I forget my other thought, but and then this last thing that I was going to say is, even in his defense, so let's say like these different systems purely on economic activity, or the organization of economic activity, without this question of the state, or is that actually feasible? Because I think the question that they're also running against is, now you have, for example, communist China, that's in terms of economic modalities, where its production is actually greater than something like a capitalistic economic order here. And so I think that's what it's also trying to juggle
Which
with.
is an interesting question, suggesting that China has freed the productive force of the people whereas the West has not. That might be the critical criteria that the Chinese state has gone further in liberating the productive forces, that is, the human being in all of his or her potential, including intellectually and work and all of that. Whereas I think you're absolutely right. I know one quick point. I know one of your interests is the study of the Chinese state, how it is functioned, and what is it function for.
Well, and that's the thing. Do you free the productive forces solely based on economics? Or in the sense that, or is it the actual potential of a human being as well? And I think, I mean, China's still getting at this question too.
Right.
But in terms of who controls the state, it has been better at doing so than this system.
Yeah. Okay. I wanted to, I thought that was very significant. I mean, to listen to him and like look at a few of his older articles and even older interviews and stuff, because I sometimes feel that the moment we start talking about the black worker and the history of capitalism and democracy and so on, because because in the free school we almost live with the voice every day, that it sometimes feels, it's inevitable that the moment somebody from out is trying to talk about it, it always feels inadequate. Like like, why is this, it always seems, and it is, too little too late and all of that. But I thought it was significant that he's sort of getting at these questions. And I mean, some of the things that have been said, I thought was, this question of the state and how the state is inseparable from capitalism. I mean, what also Alice was bringing up, I think it's significant today because, of course, the the crisis of the state that we have been talking about in this time is significant, and the way he talks about capitalism as evolving through. I mean, that's the thing you were also bringing up about capitalism itself. I mean, never having the promise of stability because it's inherently a revolutionary system. That's the way he puts it.
Yes.
That essentially it transforms through the transformation of regimes, and he talks about the slavery and then the Keynesian order. I mean, I guess then the, like what you were calling the laissez-faire, and then the Keynes, and then the neoliberal order, and that we are in a stage of course, everybody who's watching knows that it's a time where profound opportunities are in front of us, of a new kind of state is what we would probably be saying, a new kind of democracy. But I found the question that you asked very significant, that is this simply a new, I mean, the transformation that we are looking at in front of us, is that simply a new transformation of the mode of production, that is going from from slavery, you went, like slavery being a mode of production, you went to a new mode of production to with the in the 1920s and 30s, and we saw what happened there, the repression and so on. And we are now seeing the failure of the neoliberal system of production and all of this. But I feel like, the question that you're asking about, are we looking at not simply a new mode of production, a new
Can I just
economic...
make one small thing? See, I think he uses, rather than mode of production, organization of production. I'm sorry.
Right. Yeah, because I mean, I think the question that you're asking also makes me think that what we are looking at now is, I mean, the possibility that we are looking at is not simply a new way of organization, a new a new kind of economic order, but also a new stage of consciousness. And this is why, how you are putting the capitalism as something that arose within the white supremacist social system. I think this is very significant because we're talking about a new, like this is why we're talking about a new history of consciousness. And I think this is something he, it seemed to me that that's the thing he's trying to grapple with. But of course, he's not talking about it in philosophical terms. He is, I mean, he's a historian, but he's talking like an economist most of the time, I guess. But I think the question of human consciousness, a new stage of consciousness, going back to, like, it's very interesting that this 500-year-old period, which is not only the period of the rise of new kinds of, like social organization and economic order, but it's also the 500-year also, this period also marks the transformation of the, like, Martin Luther and the Protestant ethic.
Yes, yes.
And I think it's very significant that we are having this, like, that these people are coming to face this question fully now about what is, like, how can the state transform itself so that capitalism as an economic, as an economic order, as an economic system, can still be preserved. And I think, like, some of the things that I was that did stand out to me, like, firstly, I think I liked his, in some of the other interviews, I guess I like his impatience with certain things about, for instance, about this whole question of, capitalism being good or bad, because this is something that, it has been, like, done to death, because everybody has been talking about capitalism for, and I think what he's saying also about a need for a new kind of theory where you can't, he puts it like this, that we are looking at a time where we can't simply update Marx, that we are looking at a time when new theory is, and I didn't really hear him talk as much about Du Bois, but I assume that he knows, Du Bois, that I think this is significant because uh, yeah, coming out of Harvard and so on, because I think this is a real question that that humanity as a whole is grappling with, like, what is going to be, and this is also why we deal with this question every week, like, what is a new theory for this time, what is a new way of, like, what you would call the logic of investigation of this time. I mean, can we afford to simply, ornament, like, just update the kind of theory that was produced, where, it was at a time when the mode of production itself was supposed to be, it was supposed to contain everything about the logic of capitalism. And I think, I mean, that's the reason I was calling it the mode of production, because slavery is always, like you're saying, it's always been argued that it's a way, it's outside capitalism. And I think this also plays out in many ways today, because people, like, we hear this the kind of infantile arguments about, oh, do you like, what is your relationship to capitalism and so on, do you accept it or not, or, there are these different ways of being, for instance, in like, sort of going back, retreating from the world, and to use examples of, say, the Native American, like, worker, or, I guess in India it's a question of the tribes and so on. And this argument also sees the, it also sees the black proletariat as simply enslaved and not an enslaved worker, and therefore this as, a rejection of capitalism. But what Du Bois, of course, is saying is that this is instrumental. There could not have been the world we know as we know it today is because of the, the black worker being central to it. And the other thing I wanted to say was, yeah, this thing that you were also saying about how, it's not slavery, but it's the defeat of Reconstruction that is crucial. And I think he, in places he tries, I think he also comes close to it, because, he sort of puts it like racism, being invented. That's the way he puts it, that racism was invented in the 20th century in order for capitalism to continue after the previous mode of production, slavery, was abolished. And I don't, I don't completely disagree with the way he puts it, because he's saying that there had to be a new kind of social organization which served as the economic foundation for this stage of capitalism, like post emancipation. And I mean, I think this is, I thought it was very deep that, this is sort of how he is basically saying that he's agreeing with Du Bois that the color line is an invention of the 20th century. And the color line is not to be confused with just, slavery or with colonialism as a whole, but it is a specific invention that serves capitalism, that served the white supremacist state, as it moved on from slavery. And I think this is, yeah, I mean, I wanted to bring that out because it is deep. I think that I guess he is a mainstream historian in some ways, even though he is saying that he is fighting the usual assumptions of economics, the usual teleological assumptions of economics. He's fighting that, but accepting him as sort of a mainstream Harvard historian, I think it's deep. That I think it shows that the ruling class is actually like without an answer, without an answer, and therefore people like this are, coming more and more into the foreground, where they have to contend with Du Bois, where they have to contend with even this question of logic, even this question of, how, yeah, and I guess I had a few other things to, like one thing I was thinking was, and I don't want to this to be distraction, but when you were saying that sort of his pedagogy coming from Germany and the social democratic influence, I think when it comes to the question of, when it comes to question of, actually doing politics, that's where his weakness comes out, because I think in one of the interviews he's asked the question of reparations, right? And his answer to that, his answer to that goes to sort of the usual white guilt, and he of course takes the example of Germany, and the example that he goes back to is Germany paying reparations to Israel. This is before 2 years back, but it's still not the best example to take up. But I think his the question of his I think his whiteness comes out when when he goes out of his comfort zone of talking about the mode of production, the organization and distribution question, and goes to the question of politics, which I think that's why we are also trying to critique him, because we are not simply talking about, we're not talking about the black worker as an academic way to understand America, but we're talking about how to do politics. What does it what does it mean? What you were saying about the capacity of black folk, and how much we we have to go back to the black struggle to actually understand what to do today.
Can I say that I also really appreciate us listening to this. I guess it's an interview, but it also sounds like it's some kind of global capitalism series or something. It'll sound like they'll talk about this for a while. This thinker, Sven Beckert. I think I was really quick to dismiss him when I first listened to him, but actually listening to it together and hearing us all break it down, I was like, oh, I shouldn't have been that dismissive that off the bat, because there were important things for us to actually talk through in terms of what we're saying about. It is pretty remarkable that this kind of this deep of a need from the ruling elite to figure out the crisis of the total state, also as you're saying, the cost of empire, but also capitalism. They need to put all their energies and all their eggs in a basket to figure this out, even while trying to retain and hold on to something, defend capitalism, basically, in a time when capitalism is outpaced by even China or the darker nations. And I also go back to how you began by saying that we're at the stage in terms of free school, having been working at so many questions for now at least 14, 15 years. Don't quote me on the math, but we're entering a very interesting period of America's 250th anniversary, which will have to be celebrated by the state or by so many organizations. And ideologically, all the questions are on the table, all the questions of this, in fact, it is pretty hard to even try to say it will be a celebration, because there really are so many open-ended questions. And that is what makes this a really, heady kind of time. And free school should have a plan or a vision for just, the fact that we actually have been thinking about these questions long before this anniversary became, a bigger deal. But it's the reason we're taking from, a longer tradition that has always found these questions to be open-ended and not fully resolved if using, say, the logic of the founding fathers alone, or of, say, capitalism or modes or organizational, like organization of like labor, those kinds of questions, those kinds of frameworks, those are actually very insufficient for explaining why after 150 or so years after Reconstruction, Black people were quote unquote granted freedom, but they're still not free. Like there's too many questions about like, you know, democracy, you know, having come this far. This revolution, this American revolution, it is so incomplete now. So I find that this is really actually important to take up because I just can say a few things about even my organization, like where I work. These are the questions that actually, these are very guiding questions actually for that many even mainstream organizations are putting out. This is why the Ken Burns documentary is so interested in 1776, like, and then this is why even the, you know, Trump is very interested in trying to become, you know, insert himself into the 250th narrative of like how, you know, just everyone, there's so much being, worked out, or there's so many voices and chatter, and it is really important to say, go back to Du Bois and to say that, there has been a tradition working at these questions, and they're actually in this time of so much crisis. Like the voice that comes back to me right now is also not only Du Bois, but also a King who took up Du Bois, and the contrast I was starting to think about as like we were listening to Sven Beckert talking, especially when he reaches that end where he says like, oh, like there are so many means to solving hunger, housing, and healthcare and education. Somehow we seem to be thinking of a mode of scarcity, but we really can't solve it all. It's just so sad that we are not able to politically find a way to reach that. And I was kind of surprised that the interview just ended right there, because I was like, wait, that's it. He just kind of left it on a bit of a cliffhanger, because I feel that in so many of King's speeches, he makes it so clear that it is not like, whether, especially towards the end of King's life, but, you know, as an emblematic, you know, the direction that the civil rights movement, the Third American Revolution, coming out of what was unfulfilled about the Second American Revolution, and even this idea that like, is it really that, is it the founding fathers' ideals of democracy and freedom are unfulfilled, or is it Black people's ideals of freedom, liberty, and democracy are unfulfilled? And if we're trying to fulfill the founding fathers, you know, ideals alone, you know, coming out of the Enlightenment, coming out of, say, that period, I mean, that's not an insignificant part, but what about, like, you know, the promises or even the ideals or even the potential of democracy in the South during Reconstruction, and how those are so thwarted, so like with the rise of this new kind of white supremacy that had to come into place to begin to restructure American society after slavery, and those unfulfilled promises leading to such a thing as, say, the Great Migration, all of this. That's why I really appreciate what we said about the development or the studying of the consciousness of the Black worker, and like the consciousness part of it was just so missing from Sven's, like quote unquote, like teleology or like development, his trajectory of how he lays it out. Consciousness was just not part of it, but it is almost like the reason why I'm so interested in this thing of consciousness is because King is always saying that like, no, it's not just that there's an economic or yes, it's an economic reason why those problems have not been solved, but it's actually a moral issue. Morality is the reason why the society has not been able to, not been able to, because of white supremacy, want to solve the problem of poverty. Yes, we could solve the problem of poverty, and he's also talking about even the world where it's like, yes, of course we have all the food in the world, and there's even food going to waste. But actually, when I visited the streets of Calcutta, like I'm forgetting the speech entirely, but he's like, there's so many starving people in India when I'm there. There's so many starving people around. I know exactly where all the food could go, in the bellies of these starving children. And he says that there's a reason why there's a reason why poverty is not actually solved here, and it is in a sense like because we have not solved the problem of human brotherhood or even racism here. And I think that those are, it's just such a contrast for me to hear how Sven talks about it as like, oh, it's a political solution. If only we could just, reorganize capitalism to do so. But actually, I think that to take up this thing that King increasingly did towards the end of his life, whether it was a form of moving from the South to the North in the Chicago program and taking up the question of urban poverty or like racism in the North, in these northern cities, or even his resistance against the Vietnam War and his stance against U.S. empire or the Poor People's Campaign. All the things that he was starting to take up were, I think, emerging out of not only this Du Boisian framework, but also just this increasingly call towards like, I don't know, just something about the world house or this idea of like that just to me sounds more like compelling. It includes this like moral component that I feel that this like, yes, capitalism is a global system connecting many different systems. Like there's something a little neutral about it in which like, no, actually, it's not just about like reforming capitalism to continue to be global. Maybe I'm being a little simplistic, but I am trying to say that there is something actually compelling about when you move so many of these, when free school has taken up so much of what King was trying to do so seriously in this time, and to be able to say that there is such a thing as a moral commitment that a people can make that can actually rearrange all of these relationships, rearrange all of these quote unquote forces, unleash these forces. It's also about unleashing a moral potential, a moral force. And I feel that there's something that I think that the chapter of his last book, Where Do We Go From Here, the final one, The World House, is one that I want to go back to, because I feel that it is in some ways King acknowledging, I think, the bloody or even complex, development of Western civilization or America or even like capitalism, but actually proposing certain kinds of paths forward through a revolution of values that I think actually, it just feels so much more compelling and actually what we're in the business of actually trying to work out.
And even actionable.
Yes.
Not just, elites talking, but I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just really love when King says, what he says about the barefoot peoples of the world rising up. So it's like those who sat in darkness saw a great light, and just the way in which he's talking about both, Black folk, whether even you could apply it to like general strike or the time of Reconstruction, or even to all the anti-colonial struggles of the world. There is something about consciousness and a moral commitment that's necessary for actually moving from one stage of history to a complete new one that I think allows us to think more freely, or even quote unquote unleash that kind of moral potential. But I just think it is really important that in free school we are not just getting ahead, but actually figuring out what we mean by this unfinished revolution that I think so many, even in this city of Philadelphia, where it's just too unignorable, this question of how Black folk remade this city, that you can't let go of that question of like what it means to, it just cannot be solely, I don't know, a retrenchment of the ruling elite into trying to solve these crises of whether they want to do so through Harvard academics and call it a crisis of democracy or capitalism with the wave of a wand and return things to the way they were, but actually take up these unfulfilled questions.
So I wanted to ask a question, which goes back to your original remarks. Could you say a little bit more about this point you had made about labor being the key force?
Productive force.
Yes, exactly. And the distinction you were making with what is traditionally treated as the productive force, the labor productive force.
It's such an important question. The strategic productive force, in fact. Many people, let's just take plantation slavery. The way it's usually looked at is that people working from sunup to sundown being brutally exploited. But even when one attempts to understand the life world of the Black proletariat, one, the organization of work, which was not principally from above, it was the worker themselves, the slaves themselves, organizing the work, the job. They were working not just with their hands, but with tools. And the concept of technology and productive forces used by Beckert and by Marx is that the productive forces are the technology that makes for productivity. You know, that's pretty much the way we usually think about it. However, if labor, and in this case, the African proletariat, is a decisive productive force, that means the technology is not just phone or a tool. Technology is the intellect, the understanding, the consciousness, the organizational capacity of workers themselves. This is huge because it is probably the decisive productive force, the decisive technology. Now we're talking about a form of human technology, intellectual intellect as a form of technology, and not somebody working in a laboratory at such and so forth. I think in that sense, we're looking at, and this, I think I'm pretty certain that Marx makes this point also, that labor is a productive force. But here we're talking about, first of all, labor which was not even considered a part of the working class. And Beckert makes this too, that it is the decisive labor force. But I would also add to that the decisive productive force. Is that, I don't know. And that's the key. And, going forward, that's why all of these, and what Kathy was saying, what Barto was saying, hence is worthy of constant study, scientific study. How they operated as a productive force then and now. And this is Kathy's point in studying, pardon me, Alice's point. Don't beat me up, Al. Doing the comparison with China, where the state unleashes labor as a productive force. And see, that's why Du Bois, one of the central themes of all of his writing is educating the Black proletariat. What does education do? It enhances them not just in terms of education, but as a productive force. The dictatorship of the proletariat was to free the productive force, and this is Alice's point. This thing that, communist China. Why are they communists? Because they freed labor. Capitalist America. Why? Because you don't want to free labor. The concept of freeing labor is, and Beckert can't get it. He must know it because I know he has read Marx enough. He must know that you cannot free technology or productive forces without freeing the strategic productive force, which is labor, and without elevating constantly the consciousness of labor. And in this case, this is why the Du Bois thing is so important, because African labor was not considered labor, let alone a proletariat. I mean, it's a kind of a revolution of knowledge. That very category of a Black proletariat, that discovery shifts the entire way that we would analyze American history, American labor history, that discovery. But that discovery compels us as a logic of investigation to assert a trialectic. In other words, we cannot investigate American history, American labor history, and only talk about the worker and the capitalist. You ain't going nowhere with that. You have to talk about the decisive productive force, the condition for a proletariat, period. And that is the Black proletariat. It is an initial condition. And this is why, I don't know that we've always gotten everything right about it, but you know how we've been trying to work this and work it from historical, history of consciousness, all these different ways, and now going deeper into the logic of the system, but then the logic of investigation. You can't investigate American history without a triadic. If you do it dialectically, you only come up with partial explanations. You put that triad in there, you can begin to see things more holistically. I'm sorry if I overtalked.
No, this is helping me put together what I wanted to say, but can I ask you one other question?
Please.
And it's connected to something that Shimbarto had brought up. You had talked about the white supremacist social system being the organizing structure of the economic system in this country. So the question I wanted to ask is...
By the way, you just put it better than I did. Could you repeat the way you put it? I just don't... Please.
Okay, how the white supremacist social system becomes the organizing structure of the economic system in this country. And the question I wanted to ask is how this compares to Europe at the time when Marx is developing this theory. Because, and I ask this because I have so little of a sense of the consciousness of the white worker as constituted in Europe. And I'm not sure how much Marx actually sees the white worker as a human agent, the way that Du Bois sees the white and black worker, but especially the black worker as human agents. And I wanted to just say one other thing briefly. Like in Darkwater, in Of Work and Wealth, Albert was saying this, but he calls the white worker, he gives them allegorical literary names. He calls them the unwise man. And I mean, I need to also study a little bit more, but what I'm trying to put together is where Marx locates the consciousness of the human worker, the worker, and what necessitates that transformation into how Du Bois sees work and labor and the role, the centrality of human agency. But the question, to be more specific, really is about why did it seem that for Marx's time, when he was describing capitalism in Europe, that he did not need the category of a social system? Or did he need it?
Excuse me. I mean, this is the big issue. The difference between political economy and social systemic or sociological analysis. No, he did not. All of the things that you mentioned, and I don't think he would find it offensive or angering to make these critiques, because he didn't. Remember, Lenin said that there were three component parts of Marxism: French theory of the class struggle, German classical philosophy, meaning Hegel, and British political economy. Ain't no sociology in that. So he can talk, and that's Brickert. That's his investment in political economy from his German education, I'm certain. But there is no sense of complexity and a complex social system with unique logics. It's not there. You are absolutely right. Marx saw the European working class as coming out of capitalism, as being formed by capitalism, and maybe being historically constituted by capitalism, but he doesn't go far beyond that. And that's it. Du Bois sees the historic constitution of the black proletariat, and then, because of the denial of their humanity, he will then investigate their humanity. And thus, sociology, which studies the potential. And this is why Du Bois is so liberating, and then King, of course, to study the potential of humanity and how we free that potential through the democratic seizure of the state. And that's why he is, Du Bois is, that photo that we have in Avant-Garde of him on the platform with Mao and Deng Xiaoping, and they're all very stern, and he's just so happy, and or his Russia and America, where he is as an experiment in human, it's not anywhere else. Or how could he conceive? It was an imaginary leap. It was the art of Du Bois to see a general strike. It was not just a logic growing out of his study of. He had to go someplace else, deep in himself, deep in his spirit, to say these people have this capacity. Du Bois will say in many instances that what we know or the ways we talk about the European working class uprising, he said it's all exaggerated. He said it was nothing compared to the black worker. I think it's in Black Reconstruction. He says that the European description of the working class uprising and rebellions, he said it was very overrated, including 1848, including the Paris Commune, compared to 500,000 African proletariat walking off, putting down their tools. It could, and he even went as far as to say, this is not his line, but he was saying that European socialists to authorize and so on themselves exaggerated. And an exaggerating European working class became more blind to the black proletariat. And I can give you many concrete examples in my own life, in the party and in radical circles. Whereas to see the white worker, you almost had to not see the black worker. But to see the black worker makes it possible to see the potential in the white worker.
Okay.
No, I'm sorry.
Can I say a little or do you want to?
No, go. You.
Oh, purple one.
Oh, I'm sorry, Paul. I'm sorry.
No, thanks for laying that out. And then the thing that
I'm sorry if I talk too long.
No, the thing that I've been processing in our conversation is it helps me reinterpret the chronology beginning from Reconstruction and some of like how we've understood that period. But it made more concrete this formulation for you of Du Bois beginning a new world movement of thought. Because I was really trying to understand his formulation of like, the full implications of the discovery of the category of the black worker, but also this formulation that he makes of the problem of our times being that workers are not thinkers, and thinkers are not workers. And what I'm getting from our discussion, and maybe it's not totally right, is this category of the black worker ties together in a new way the question of labor really with the question of consciousness, with human agency, the human relationship to history and to freedom. And even at the end of the black worker in Black Reconstruction, he's saying, here lies the real modern labor problem, and that the exploitation of the black worker as the most exploited of darker humanity, of colonized darker humanity in a time of capitalism and colonialism. He says it's the problem of religion, democracy, and humanity. But he begins by saying that this is the modern labor problem. Um, so, so I think like to begin from a slightly different angle, Kathy mentioned this, Leah mentioned this at the start too, like, okay, next year is the 250th anniversary of the nation. And the question that's going to be on the table is what is the meaning of democracy, or what is the meaning of the American Revolution? And this idea of an unfinished revolution. And what I would think is that what we put forth that other people do not is, again, the centrality of the Black worker, a celebration of it as the human torches who have moved democracy, moved freedom, history forward in this nation, and that it is unfinished. And but like it still lives, like that consciousness still lives. And there were just a couple things that you had said where that had struck me. Like for example, when you had talked about the lineage of the Nation of Islam in the first Great Migration, or that, and you mentioned this many times, but Black people never having conceded in their commitment to the gains and the potential of the period of Reconstruction.
Never conceded.
When a democratic government under a Black system is actually possible. And I think,
but that is a kind of a rupture in the consciousness of Black folk and of immigrants.
right.
Black folk have never conceded. Immigrants don't know, well, why? I mean, why are y'all angry? Why? We never conceded.
Yeah.
But for the immigrant, that is not a question because there's nothing to concede. It's all new. It's all a beginning, new beginning. But we are waging the struggle. Oh, you know, but that's what I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Well, the last thing that I wanted to touch on is, this category of the thinking worker. It also helps, what we were discussing today helped me also reinterpret certain things we had talked about. Like, for example, with the music symposium and what made possible the emergence of, I mean, a greater renaissance in the European Renaissance, of that unleashing of genius among
of productive forces.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm sorry.
And so I think today when we're looking at the study of deindustrialization, it's important to see it as that an attempt to totally destroy the Black worker, who is also a thinker. And I think that is what explains something like, incarceration for one, where the idea is that you remove, you separate Black people from the capacity to be a worker altogether, and you do everything it takes to prevent them from being a productive force. But I think hence, like in our sociological work or in our lives, that effort we continue to make to see where the consciousness of the Black worker still exists and still struggles and exists. Because, for example, something that we've talked about is like, well, are incarcerated men and women still workers? You know what I'm saying? Do they still have that proletarian consciousness? And I would argue yes, constituted differently, evidence being something like Brother Gregory and the Reform Ministry. So yeah, I know my thoughts are not the most organized, but I'm trying to put something together in my head.
But the thing that I wanted to talk about is your question about why did Marx not need the category of a social system. It actually reminded me of something you had said even 3 years back when we did the 10th anniversary and we had a panel on the boys. I forget, it was probably a response to an essay you had written about the boys and the boys Lenin synthesis. I think that was the first time.
Yeah, right here.
Right here. And I think Michelle's question, and I've been thinking about it for 3 years, that's why it came back to me, because I think you had asked why did sociology or revolutionary sociology, why did it have to emerge in America and with the boys? And I think those questions are related. And the farthest I had come in making sense of it was really that sociology as a study of human deed and of the human being, as Du Bois puts it, it seems like it became the most urgent or the most essential at, like, I don't know if I would say the weakest point of capitalism, but the point of capitalism, which was the most egregious violation of not just class exploitation, but the degradation of the human being through chattel slavery. And I think that's sort of how I've thought about it. But today's conversation and also what this back and forth also helped me clarify a lot. And I wanted to touch on something that Chambarto was saying, like when you were saying that you appreciate how this guy, Sven Beckert, for instance, he is not going into the question of, oh, capitalism good or bad. And I think I agree with what you said, is I think that is a very simplistic level of discourse. And it's very easy. There's always a shortcut for you to feel good about yourself and feel progressive or whatever by just saying, I'm against
So it's only
capitalism.
worthy of a person like Tucker Carlson or Donald Trump, good, bad.
Yeah, good, bad, and whatever. But then he makes the argument is, I am trying to do the work of actually identifying what capitalism is,
Yes,
what it
yes.
has historically meant, what are its mechanisms, and what stage are we of the
Yes.
capitalistic order today. And I think that's a worthy investigation, because I
Absolutely.
don't think it's completely understood.
And necessary at this stage.
It's necessary because even what he's saying and everything that we discuss, I think the first or the most basic level conclusion from that is that you cannot understand the development of capitalism without considering slavery to be really its cornerstone, right?
Or constitute,
Or
could I just use the
yeah,
logic
yeah,
of social
yeah.
structure? A necessary constituent, constituting of capitalism. It is not external to capitalism,
Right.
laws of capitalism, and then there's slavery, which was an aberration. No, slavery and the black proletariat are a constituent part of the formation, even as a Michelle kind of put, a structuring structure. It is decisive. It is inconceivable without. And so Beckett is right. We've been talking about the wrong thing all this time.
Yeah, but the thing that I wanted to point out was that you were even saying that, in the American context, it's you have to go towards the triad. But if slavery is that foundational,
It's a world.
and capitalism itself is a global phenomenon that
Absolutely.
cannot be
You're
studied
right.
in just its particularities, then the question of Du Bois and his different modes of thinking, trialectics, but also sociology,
Yes.
I think it cannot just be
I agree-
limited
I
to the
agree with-
American context.
I agree
At
with
the
you. I agree. I'm sorry.
no, and
This gets us back to Jeremiah. You remember Jeremiah?
the general.
The general and specific theory. And Jeremiah said, well, what if Du Bois's theory is the general theory and Marx is the specific theory? And I think Jeremiah was 100% right the more you think about it, which is your question. The logic, quote, the logic of capitalism is specific to Europe, perhaps, but the general logic has always been trialectic.
Yeah, and even in Marx working out what that was, I think he was like he couldn't see all of it. So
he
if that
couldn't.
is the universal theory we are working on for the I don't know how many years now.
Yes,
So I think what he's doing, like, of course, the question is whether he'll take it to its logical conclusion or take it all the way. But like Shambartha was saying, I do find it significant that a group of people at Harvard are even or have been compelled to actually take this seriously instead of just like defaulting to the easy route, which is to be like, oh, Marxism. And the last thing I wanted to say though is that at that point is where I think like this thing is saying that, oh, I just want to study capitalism as it developed without going into questions of whether it was moral or not.
Yes.
I feel like that also has its like endpoint, because as soon as you make this claim that, oh, today we have the productive capacity to feed all of the poor of the world, to give housing, decent jobs, we have it all, we are able to do it, and yet it seems like Western societies are not being able to do it, whereas like Alice was saying, China is able to do it, and not through capitalism. So what does this all mean? And then For him, the answer is, oh, we have to stop talking about productive forces and then talk about distribution.
Yes.
But then doesn't it
yes.
inherently have a moral question in it? The question of how wealth and the benefits of, a capitalistic society is distributed essentially has to collide with the moral question of who do you consider as human being, as the voice puts it. And I don't know where I was going with that, but yeah, I mean, ultimately coming back, any theory that actually has a way to leap forward to the next stage of understanding what these global forces, what these historically constituted systems of society, but also economics and so on. Any theory, I mean, like you were saying, the initial conditions of that have to be these moral questions rooted in the human being.
Can I say one thing?
Yeah.
And I was just thinking as the moral preconditions for the future. You know, everything in King, you cannot talk about the future without talking about Martin Luther King and the Third American Revolution. But, this idea of what you're saying, if it is a matter of distribution, then what is making it so difficult to distribute this wealth? And what King would say, it is a moral failing of modern man. Not what, as he, which makes the whole thing really emotional to think about.
Yeah, but also what Michelle was saying, this idea, and I thought, I think the most striking thing for me, which I want to think a lot about from today's conversation, was you saying that if you're talking about productive forces, it is the human beings.
Yes.
As the human being as the strategic productive force that
Yes.
has to be considered.
Yes.
Where I feel like like in thinking about like what will be the next stage of capitalism, a lot of these thinkers and so on, I mean, are they really thinking about the working class per se? Or actually, I don't know how to say it, but it's not really a matter of how much a country is able to produce, but what is the quality of life or quality of consciousness of the working people who actually do the producing, which never ends up being the central category.
Which is then the civilizational question. Have we gotten to the end point of Western civilization? This 1,000-year, you would say 500, I said 1,000-year run. Has it come to an end? And thus are we on the cusp of a new axis of human civilizations?
I think this guy is also against, sorry, just one thing. I think this guy is actually also against the concept of the invisible hand,
Oh yeah.
I think that
the market
and everything. So I feel like what we were saying is that the worker is the very visible hand that is, kind of developing all of these systems, and they have been invisibilized. And I get a lot of this from working with Michelle, and we've been talking about mass incarceration a lot, and how these people who've been put into prison, they're almost invisible.
Yes.
And I know we're talking about market forces, but these are people who are there, whose capacity exists, their consciousness exists. And I think that the work that we are doing is to try to make that more apparent, more visible. Just last thing, I wanted to say something to Michelle's question when she said, why did Marx not see a social system in Europe? I was just immediately reminded of this very nuanced observation that Baldwin did, and then I read about it, and then I was like, okay, that makes a lot of sense. Where he points out that the difference between America and Europe is that in America, the slaves and the slave owners were together. They lived together. Their fate was intertwined. It wasn't just a physical arrangement. It was a deep psychological and cultural and social entanglement. Right? And I think that that is what gave rise to the possibility of a social system, and which affected the entire concept of we're talking about trialectics. It's no longer something that can be imagined as workers and capitalists. Now you have to take into consideration this whole other category which does not exist in your land, who's living on your land, with whom you have conversation, where there is interaction. It's not like in the colonies where Europe exists and then the colonies are in Africa or Southeast Asia. So I think that Du Bois recognizes this. The first time I read it was in Baldwin. He says that it mattered how this proximity of the enslaved and the slave owner.
Could I just say a couple things? First of all, the prison population, we could term a stranded population. A stranded population which are physically separated from the black proletariat, but not consciously so. The other thing is the study of spatial organization of production, of productive forces. When the slave owner or the owner and the worker occupy the same space, the architecture of the system is different from colonialism. Hence, the consciousness of the black proletariat is different. And that's that Baldwin thing where he says, I know you. And they do. I know you. And I know things about you that you don't want nobody to know. That kind of, the.
You mean how Du Bois says, I see the innards and the organs of the white man. I guess I wanted to go off of what Shantanu was saying about the visible and the invisible. You read like a part of The World in Africa. Can you repeat that part about toil? Oh, sorry. Because I had a question about how Du Bois sees toil. Because he writes.
He sees what?
Toil.
Oil.
Soil.
Oh, yeah. Soil.
Okay. In a hymn to the People, Du Bois capitalizes toil. And then he says something about we see the nakedness of toil and the poverty of wealth. So I'm just trying to understand
the poverty of wealth.
Yes.
Poverty of wealth.
The poverty of wealth.
Oh wow.
So I'm trying to understand what Du Bois is getting at in his conception of the emancipation of labor. So that's why I wanted to talk to you to read
I can read out this part.
Because you mentioned like secrecy, right? But
Yeah.
So I took nakedness as a certain meekness or a humble quality to it, but it sounds like Du Bois with toil is actually trying to say the like honesty or like the complete openness of seeing what toil is in its purest form. So
Yes.
I can read out that line if you want. So
Take your time with it, man.
But when the nature of work, its methods and results are hidden behind legal barriers, so that a man knows neither what he is doing nor what the results of his toil will be, or who will enjoy it, or why, nor whence, nor how his income is made, nor at whose hurt or will, then the opportunity for human degradation is limited only by the evil possibilities of the lowest of men. Murder and theft may ensue with no chance to fix the guilt. Not mass production, but mass concealment is the sin of the capitalist system.
Sorry, you read that and I still don't understand. Because I'm trying to understand why Du Bois writes of work and wealth, right? Why he puts it that way. Because at first I thought of work and wealth is basically saying like you can have opportunity, you can have jobs, and you can have labor, but without man as the center and without moral values, you get something like the microcosm of St. Louis. But now I'm trying to understand what like toil and the organization of toil and the emancipation of toil means. Right? Just thinking a lot.
See, this concept is also in Karl Marx's Das Kapital, when he talks about the fetish of commodities. The exploitation is concealed behind the commodity by the market. You know, I think what Du Bois is getting at is that market forces do more to conceal the essence of production. That's where I would read it. And by the commodity, Marx meant something that is bought and sold, market relationships. He talks about the fetish meaning something that you look up to. We all want things, and to a certain extent, we all do need things. But these things, these commodities conceal the worker who produces these things, and the fact that the worker that produces these things is exploited, that a part of what he produces, a big part of what he produces doesn't go to himself and his welfare, it goes to a class that owns the means of production. I think that's what Du Bois is getting with the concealment.
I'll say something briefly, like that passage from The World in Africa really spoke to me because I feel like at Cornell there were few professors that took up the idea of trying to incorporate Marx into some of the, but it was that actually I came across it in art history class because art is something that also gets fetishized.
Yes.
But basically, the big thing I also want not just concealment, but also deception. That like so much of capitalism is also hinged on deception and also isolating and creating greater divides between the worker and the person who receives and uses the goods, and almost like deceiving you into believing that something is good or something is valuable or something is needed versus what is actually important, what is actually necessary, and then to fuel a sense of like, the transactions that are needed to fuel capitalism, the transactions and the profit, accumulation that has to propel a certain system that is so different than what is actually necessary for the fulfillment of actual human needs. And like the way it was explained to me, it's that like in a system you would actually, this goes actually we were at Mother Bethel, and the new pastor there, Reverend Cavan, is quoted from the Isaiah 65:17 about like God said to Isaiah, I believe, like, I will create a new heavens, and in it, like, the old things will not be remembered, but actually those who work and build houses will live in the houses. Those who cultivate the grapevines will drink the wine. Those who, and then she said, or Reverend Cavan said that, like, isn't it really remarkable that Black folk have built so many houses and never lived in them? Isn't it so sad that like we have grown so much cotton or even like food or everything, and we never ate or saw any of the profits? Isn't it so sad that like where did all that go? But also in the world that we're trying to create, and we have been trying to create it for so long. Take this church, for example. We are trying to build houses that we actually live in. We want those children, our children, that actually eat the food or reap the rewards. Like this goes back to the questions that I think you've asked, not just today, but also a couple of different conversations about what it means for that concealment or that secrecy to actually be, cast aside, and there to be an honest relationship between the work that one does, the hands you will, and the fruits of one's labor, that I feel that we're in the business of trying to bridge. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to briefly say, something that Michelle was saying, and I think Purva was also responding to it. I wanted to go back to it. When you're bringing up the idea of thinking workers and working thinkers, because I think this is something that Sven Beckert and many others are saying now about us not being at a time of history where production is it's the delimiting factor, the fact that distribution is. But I think what we have also been trying to deal with for some time, and maybe close to a couple of years now, is that how you, I think this is related to how we understand the state, because the state, in like European thought coming out from Marx is understood as, what controls the means of production. And I remember in the first knowledge conference that, we did a couple of years back, it was Raju who brought up the question of, the production of ideas being, what really controls, like what really defines the state now. And I think this is something that, even a few days back we were talking about, some of these articles that keep coming now, about how to understand the ruling elite as really not simply as a financial class, but as a narrative making class. And I think this is something, it's deep, that, like what you're bringing up, but the fact that Du Bois, argues for it. He's saying that the worker cannot simply be understood as a producer of, commodity, but as a producer of culture, as a producer of thought and ideas and knowledge. And I think this is something that we are contending with now. We are contending with the fact that, yeah, it's not simply a question of distribution of commodities, that, it's not a simple answer, but it's also a question of, yeah, how do you see the world, how do you know the world. And I think this is a civilizational question, because ultimately, for, the transformation that we're looking at, that Du Bois is arguing for, is not simply a transformation of logics by itself, but it's like, for this to happen, white civilization has to be described. It has to be described from without, from outside of it. This description cannot come from a Harvard. It can come, that's where it comes from Du Bois. And I think, like, this is why I think, even like now with the, like, all kinds of, like narratives coming out from, like the New York Times and so on, they're having to contend with the fact that I think they're having to contend with the fact that it might be impossible. I mean, I think it is impossible to transcend white civilization from within. And this is why the question of, how black civilization has seen white civilization, it becomes imperative for us to deal with, because the question is not simply of distribution of commodities, but really of production of new, ideas, and, music and so on, which calls ultimately for a new kind of human being who's going. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that because that's what it reminded me of.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I made it clear enough when I spoke, but I think what became more concrete to me or more specific to me is that it's not just that, for example, I forgot his last name already. Is it Berg?
Beckett.
Beckert.
Yeah.
It's not that he doesn't see the enslaved worker. It's that he has no concept of Du Bois's category of the black worker, where it's not just a black person, it's a black agent of history,
Yeah.
arising from a unique historic constitution.
Yeah.
And I feel that this is what we've encountered a lot in our work in preschool this year, and also the sociology study, where, I mean, people will address the black community or seek a relationship to the black community, but on what terms? And really, can you understand that they are the conscious vanguard of the society moving forward? And again, this also goes back to our conversation about Mandani and why this is a huge blind spot of his. Yeah.
I think maybe we should read the.
So we have a lot of comments.
A lot of comments.
I'll try to be selective.
Okay.
But,
We'll read as many as you can.
yeah. So from earlier in the discussion, Michelle Bell says that a couple of weeks ago, when the topic of dialectics and math and computing was discussed, I was lost. But later on, I thought of a passage in the Souls of Black Folk. In chapter 6, Du Bois said that the black man in the Old South appeared as a tertium quid, or mysterious item connecting two known entities, somewhere between man and cattle. This immediately helped me see the huge analytical impacts of a three-pronged logic. I get it now, so thank you. And so later on, Bambalai says that the term cotton picking has been or is used to define it's basically used as a slang predominantly among whites, and I think this was when we were like listening to the interview when Beckert was talking about the cotton production being central to capitalism, and yeah, there's a lot of people commenting on how it's about like your initial remarks that they're commenting. Michelle Bell says that the professor absolutely um, uh, I think this is talking about Sven Beckert, that the professor dissed the worth of workers and human beings, and I think this is something that I think we dealt with in our discussion also about how to critique a Sven Beckert, and the BK says that the essence of whiteness is destruction, so it will ultimately destroy itself, and founding fraudsters, not fathers. Um, and actually, I'm trying to get back to because Jahan and Meghna had some comments that I'm trying to reach. Okay. Yeah, Bambalai also said that art changes people. People are people's medicine. No telling how AI will change people in strange ways. Uh, Okay, and so yeah, Jahan says that I think with difference, Beckert is using the academic concept of difference, emerging from intersectionality, etc., to get at things like race, gender, and culture. The new history of capitalism is a big trend among historians at elite institutions like Harvard and Cornell. Some, like Beckert, have focused on colonialism, and others have looked at the slavery in the US South and the ways that the economics of Wall Street and the industrial North were essential to the slave trade and Southern slavery. Clearly, they are contending with Marxism and globalization, and now the backlash to globalization, financial crisis, and Trumpism in order to give some intellectual energy to the US ruling elite. I think, yeah. Uh, and then Meghna says there's a passage in Dark Water where Du Bois says he and his students were both a part of a social problem and trying to solve it. This is of the work and of work and wealth. So there was a little danger. So there was little danger of their work being purely theoretical or academic. It seems to me that whiteness stops academics from seeing that they too are part of the problem and committing to find a solution, and hence Becker's inability to see democracy and the black proletariat. Until human consciousness evolves away from whiteness, we will never deal with the contradictions of capitalism. Uh, then somebody called David Ball says that I had comrades, white women specifically, refer to themselves as reflagged Africans. Asked why, because they identified and gave up what they considered the definition of insult or whiteness. The answer to the question of the 21st century is in that change in consciousness. Like Fidel said, the revolution is over when the people pick up the gun, not putting it down. Uh, and Michelle Bell later also says that Becker's views ignores an ever worsening economic problem that has resulted from his precious capitalism, human labor versus machines, etc. And I think the question of jobs and deindustrialization is significant too. Like we were also talking about this, uh, and uh, okay, so. Yes, David Ball also says that the capitalist has poured billions into preventing a revolution in the one discipline they feared the most, psychology, Marxist one. I'm not sure what to make of it right now. Uh, and finally, I'll just read one from BK. Just capitalism, communism, or socialism, etc., are not inherently good or bad. It is more an issue of the quality of the shared consciousness of the administration of the administrators of the system. So I think he's like talking about how you talk about the white supremacy social system being the superstructure within which capitalism has existed. And so the question of the moral transformation is of the social system and not uh, the economic. And so he continues that so any political or socio-economic system that falls underneath the white supremacy social system will manifest the same outcomes. The Harvard professor cannot escape this.
By the way, I don't refer to the social system as a superstructure. Yeah, because that it has specific meaning in Marxist terminology. I refer to the social system as the macro system, and yeah, so and then the
The
other
structure that
parts of it,
structures.
And by the way, I won't get into this right now. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I think that's that's the end of comments.
The other thing is the engine of the social system, the logic of the social system is the trilectic, the threes. But the social system is the, the overall system. And we'll talk more about that because in some ways we got to work this out. The difference between the logic of the social system as a macro system and the social system. It's logic, but this, what is the driving logic, the driving mechanism of the social system? Kind of what we call the logic of the system, but there's a whole lot to think about and work out in this. But the inescapable fact is that logically, from an investigative point of view, and from understanding how the system is constituted, you have to have at least these three: capitalist, the white worker, and the black worker. And once you see that there's more, you can understand the social system better, especially the social system that emerges after the defeat of Reconstruction.
So, I think it's nearing that time.
Yes.
Okay, it was a great discussion. Thanks, everyone. See you all next week.
So good.